kerosene and a paintbrush, daub it in all the corners. By God, they said, where we can get some kerosene? I said, that's up to you. But they did. That was my idea. From then on, they contaminated all the beds with the kerosene and the paintbrush in the corners. That's where they make their nests, right in the corners, the railing, the rails, steel.
So that was, where was it that you had liberated the
That one place, that's going to be Wolfenbüttel. Wolfenbüttel.
And so that was a concentration camp?
Yeah, that was a concentration camp, yeah.
So what was, when you came in there, was it, you liberated it, nobody had...
Right, yeah.
What was that like when you found that?
Well, it was the activity, American, like for instance, when we went into something like that, the military government and the CIC was always involved because they knew before we did, and they relayed it on to us, my leaders, the general and the colonel and stuff. And so that was, what they come up to me. I was going to supervise some, we had bunch of Italian soldiers there that we liberated. Here's a picture of them that I brought in, the whole group. And then we had some Germans we getting to move out the cots that were empty and then decontaminated with the kerosene and the paintbrushes, and then they put them in a separate building. They liberated it, and where they could start feeding them and nursing them back to health. So, of course, we couldn't stay there. That was just something we'd obligated to do before we moved on.
Did you know what, I mean, looking back, people, I know what it was that you were going into because I've seen the newsreels. Did you at the time know what it was that you were sent to do? I mean, or were you surprised when you got to this?
No, I wasn't surprised. I was expecting, I didn't, it was new to me. I wasn't surprised, because I think we liberated some slave worker camps before, and this year was one of and the word got around fast, it was a death camp. And so when we went into that, I was walking around and the other guys went up. I seen the bodies stacked up there off to the side, but I didn't go up and look at them. I mean, I couldn't see any object in it because I knew what I'd seen enough as the way it was, and so I knew what it was, and so I just went about the chores, the assignments that they give me, and I got a better acquainted with the Italian soldiers and stuff.
What was their mood like? Because I assume that they're pretty dehydrated, starved.
Well, no, they were in pretty good shape. You can tell by the picture.
Really?
They were. The situation was, I think they were originally taken to fight with the Germans on the German side, and then it just didn't. They didn't get them lined out. They was regular in civilian clothes. Fact is, I give them a couple blankets, a couple of ones I know that got pictures in there, and they had a German seamstress make them some nice olive drab jackets out of them blankets.
Out of the blankets.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because you did. By that time, it was the battle bulge was over, and you didn't need many blankets anyway. It was warm.
I wanted to go back a little bit first and talk to, because if I remember right, you were born in Iowa, right? That's
Ohio.
Ohio.
Yeah.
And then you grew up kind of in Colorado.
Yeah.
What about your mom and dad? What did your dad do?
Well, my dad was a Austrian coal miner. He and my grandfather and my uncles, they come over here from Austria, and they settled along the Ohio Valley there, where the steel mills and the coal mines was, West Virginia coal fields. My grandfather, he worked there, all his life in West Virginia coal fields. My dad, he he got out of coal fields and joined the Army. And then he went to Texas, and that's where he did his training. And he went to Cooks and Baker School. He was in a motor transport unit. And so he was, from when he got out of there, he promoted to mess sergeant. So he was a mess sergeant. And then he met my mother, and that's where they got married. I think it was 1920, something like that. And so he chose. Then he went back to the coal mines, steel mills and stuff. And they moved back to Ohio then, with my dad's parents.
So is that where he was for the Depression then? Would have been back in...
That was in the worst part of the Depression, right. I remember when my uncle took me fishing down the Ohio River. Well, I could see he went to Bridgeport, Ohio. That was the bridge went over to Wheeling, West Virginia. And you could see the lines clear around the blocks, of men that were out of work, and I was trying to get food and some kind of assistance or get jobs. They couldn't get them. And of course, my dad was affected, one of them too. We lived a couple miles west of Bridgeport in Lansing, Ohio. That's where I was born. So it was, I remember the Depression. And I remember when a lot of the kids around, and I even went down too, but not consistently, and eating the soup kitchens, where they had that barley soup. It didn't taste bad. It tasted good. Wasn't no meat in it.
It was food.
Yes.
Yeah. Were you aware? I mean, again, historically, we look back and we know it was a depression and tough times. But when you're in the middle of it, are you aware that the economy is terrible, or is it just everybody's in the same boat? Or
well, it wasn't. I didn't think about the economy. I just more or less growed into it. The fact that that's just the way it was. I'd never seen anything any better. And so it was a long time, after the Depression before I was 10 years old when we left Ohio. I remember the day we left. There was a big flood in the Ohio River, and we had our car down in the garage down next to the river. We had to move it out before it got washed away. And then we left the next day.
Was your dad, were you hoping to find work for your dad, or?
Well, my mother's parents had moved up from Texas, that's where they lived, and they moved up with horses and, wagons. He raised horses, because it used to be money raising them for the cavalry, You could get good money, so he went up to Montrose, Colorado. That's what he was, and then he moved later on up north to the northwestern part of Colorado, Craig, Colorado. And that's where he started his boys growing up, and he had put them to work, and that's where they started out for farming, stuff like that, ranching.
And that sounds like, if I remember right, you said that Colorado was some of the best times of your...
Yes, that was. So when we moved there, I was 10 years old. So my dad taught me right away how to run the trap lines. We lived right on the edge of town, Craig, where the wild horses were driven into the stockyards. The stockyards were on that side. And it was the end of the railroad. They called it Denver and Salt Lake Railroad, but there was a lot of hobos were misled. When they was riding the freight trains out of Denver, they thought they was going to Salt Lake. And they'd go out there and they stuck out there in Craig, Colorado. At the end, they had a round table there to turn their trains around, you know, turntable they had, and that was the end of the Salt Lake. I didn't go to Salt Lake. There's 300 and some odd miles from there to Salt Lake, and then poor guys, you know, they'd be in hobo camps there. They'd have to head back and take another route. And so the side of the town we was on, and they brought in big herds of wild horses, and they'd bring them into stock pens, and they were loose, and they'd run by our yard. We lived out in the flatland, and they'd bring them in and slaughter them, send them away for slaughter to make glue out of them. And they were some nice horses. I think about it now. You know, then it was just indifference about it, you know. But now I think about it, and I don't like it, you know. But I run the trap line. My dad taught me how to when I was 10 years old, and he taught me how to shoot. He had a 12-gauge shotgun, and big open bore 12-gauge Stevens. And so I started shooting it right away. I mean, I wasn't very heavy, but I learned fast. So he'd give me not over 4 shells, and I'd better bring back 4 ducks or be accountable for 4 shells. Yeah. Then from then on, I went to school, and then we moved up back into the coal mine country, about 25 miles east, where they're gone now. The towns are the ghost towns, Mount Harris, Bear River, ghost towns up on the Yampa River. Right at the foot of the 17 miles from Steamboat Springs, 17 miles west. And they were pretty large mining camps. You lived in miners' cabins, you know, exact houses. And there I went to school and trapped all the time, hunted every night in the wintertime, you know, to get muskrats and beaver, and shoot them when they come out in the river swimming, you know, in water. And I had to shoot them in the head because otherwise you'd ruin their pelts, you know. So I'd pick up extra money that way, and it helped out the family and everything. Trap lines were pretty long, so sometimes it took me actually 2 days to run a trap line. I had probably 250 traps set out, and I couldn't run them good, you know, skin all the animals. And from there, while I was there, I worked for the fur companies as skinning. And of course, they bought my furs too. And then the Craig Hide and Fur Company was the one I was familiar with, but another competitor moved in from Salt Lake, and there was a conflict between them, you know. And so I stayed down at the fur company for the new Cyril Hide and Fur Company as a watchman and as a skinner, a professional skinner. So
you kind of had to, because you're still a young kid at this point.
Oh yeah.
You kind of had to be a businessman too, it sounds like, because you had to go deal with the fur companies and.
Yeah, well, they'd rip me off quite a bit, you know, on furs. You know, they just. So you had to jew them a little bit, try to, but boy, they was pretty steadfast, you know. But sometimes I thought I'd maybe get 25 cents more out of a hide than what I expected, you know. And the hide prices wasn't very much. Like you'd pay a good price for a good price. For a muskrat hide would be $1.50, and that was a big rat, you know. But usually they'd run from 50 cents to $1. And beavers, you could run up to size $5.
That's real good money then.
Yeah, but there was a lot more work. They was big. Some of them were, I called them blankets. And they had a big, even carrying them, I'd never bring them home. I had to skin them on the river, because it's too big. And and I'd bring the hides home. But sometimes if I'd run into a good show where there were some good beaver dams, maybe I'd have 2 to 4, and even that was a job, carrying them in, the hides in the gunny sack, for a few miles over the mountain. There was a big mountain there, called it Mount Harris. That was what the town was named after. I'd go right over the top of that mountain, the closest route.
So would the buyers from the fur companies, would you have to go into town and everybody would show up at the same place? Or
No,
they came out?
they always come around and picked up your hides.
They'd look and they'd say, we'll give you 20 cents, and you'd say, no, 25 cents. And
Well, I'd say, I think there should be worth more than that for a certain hide, they'd be sorting them out. And, like say if I had 100 muskrats, I'd usually start the season a little bit earlier before the season really opened up good. Because it snowed a lot, and then after your traps got snowed in, well then that was the end of the trapping season. You could uncover them for a while, but when the snow got up to between 3 and 4 feet, well then you just wait till spring, dig them out, and start all over again in the fall.
what was your mom like? Your dad sounds like a hard-working, nice guy that taught you.
He was a small man, but he was the most hardest working person that I ever seen. And he was just nothing but muscle, just a small. And of course, he went up from the steel mills. He'd worked in the steel mills back east there when I was a little kid. And he worked once for the Akron Rubber Works until they closed down. And so things were real slow. That's why he left back east. And my grandmother wanted my mother and us to move to Colorado. Of course, Colorado was depressed too, But so, and in the wintertime, like my father was working in the coal mines, the big problem was that most of the coal would be shipped to Denver. See, the railroad ended 25 miles down the line, and so to get the coal cars in, they had to go over some high mountain passes. And when it snowed real heavy, the trains couldn't get through. So they couldn't get any coal cars, gondolas. In that case too, that a lot of some of these small mining towns all through Colorado mainly, well, they were snowed in and they'd never get them out. It was on the side tracks back in them mining camps, and they couldn't get the cars out and get them moving, So that was tough to get. You couldn't get the cars in the wintertime. And then naturally, so you was out of work then too. And then in the summertime, there was no work at all because there was no demand for the coal. So it was really a tough show. It helped out me trapping some, and then I did a lot of hunting. So we had wild meat and fish a lot.
So did your mom run the house?
Yeah, she had enough. There was 6 kids, 5 or 6 kids. Then I think my brother was born when I was in Europe, and it was the last one. And she had to keep them up and go to, get on to school and stuff like that. For me, I had to be sort of a little flexible. I remember we had a nice man that delivered milk. His name was Kelso, and he ran a dairy, but it was all by wagons and team of horses, and because of the sleds, they were And so when he delivered, and like in the wintertime, it'd get, well, we didn't have any money, and we had a milk bill. Well, I had my sisters there. One of them was younger than me, and the rest of the family. And I mean, they needed some milk. Well, I remember that I dropped out of school for several weeks, and because we had to go 7 miles to the school to another town. You only had 8th grade up to the one school or in town where I lived. And later on, I went on, went out of 8th grade and had to go by bus. And so I went to work for the Kelso Dairy. I'd get up at 4 o'clock every morning, and I'd go down to the milk house, and we made a little log house. And I'd wash all the bottles and start up the stove. And of course, you got to start to burn coal and get it hot and warm up the hot water to scald the bottles with and stuff. And then I'd work the old hand separator to get the cream out. And I always wanted to have a bottle of that cream and just drink it, I did that before or later after down in New Mexico with my aunt. We lived on the farm. But I remember I never did take a bottle of that cream, in which I did it and it wouldn't make any difference to anybody, but I thought I'd be stealing, So I never did. And they give me, when I left, we was paying the milk bill with what I earned there was help pay the milk bill off so we could continue to get milk. But for each day I worked, the people who run the dairy give me a silver dollar. So I had a big, heavy bag of silver dollars, about 50 of them or better.
And that's how you helped your family.
Yeah, and then I helped out a lot because when things come up, we just didn't have no more money. Only, they had to use my money, which wasn't my money, it was the family's money. And then on top of that, all the wild game I brought home, fish and ducks mainly. And of course, you couldn't eat that meat you got the furs off of. Some of the guys, the old trappers who was around there, they'd eat it, like beaver tail soup. We tried it one time and took real good care of it and put it in a kettle and boiled the thing. The fat come out, but the smell was exactly like a strong smell of willa, because that's what they eat all the time. So it was just too much. It just ruined the whole flavor, so you couldn't eat it.
Who kept the spirits up in the family? 'Cause I mean, this is a pretty tough time out there.
Well, naturally, my spirits was always up because I always had every day to look forward to. I'd come home from school and I wouldn't eat nothing. I'd just get in the house and grab my rifle and I'd be gone until dark. And then if I bring home animals, I had to skin them, light, get some light. But usually there was enough to do, like for instance, when girls helped my mother, there wasn't no big house to take care of. Because one cabin we lived in was only 2 rooms. It was a minor shack, and we fixed it up. Put paper on the walls, some kind of a craft like pink-colored paper, reddish paper, and put it on with flathead nails and discs. And I helped my dad do it, and then we moved into that. That's when we got a job back at the other mine when we come back again. And it kept warm. All we had was curtains strung between the eating section and the sleeping section. And at times, it snowed heavy. I mean, but it had such a heavy snow on the roofs that we had a lot of coal to burn. Because I got coal from the mines, from the tipple. We lived right where the mine was, where they dumped the coal into the cars, across Wolf Creek, right on Wolf Creek. And so it was deep and running high at a lot of times, you know. But we put an anchor on each side, and we strung a cable across, a big heavy wire, but we twisted it into a cable. And then we would put pulleys on it and have buckets over on one high side, and we'd run it back and forth with cord, you know, rope, and we'd pull it back across, and that's how we got our coal over there. I'd stack it over on the far side. When they stacked the coal, they brought it in, put it in boxcars, put labels on it. And naturally, the guy that inspected it, he'd go through it, and he'd roll out any chunks of coal that was impure, or had what we call bone, which is a rock vein running through the chunk of coal. He'd always throw out some good ones along the tracks, and I had to haul it up along the tracks from where the rails was, switching where they parked their the boxcars. Then they had the gondolas, but they would have been hard to get out of. To see the boxcars, you could get them out the door. The gondolas, they used them mostly for fine coal, slack. And it was a steady job, really. I mean, to keep going. Wouldn't be hungry, because we always, even if we had one item to eat, well, we eat plenty of it. I picked potatoes too, when the potato harvest was on. There was a little farming community about 7 miles down where I went to school. And then out south of that, there's people who raised potatoes. It was hard to sell because but I know that one year I picked potatoes and they couldn't sell them, so I finally was waiting for my money. So finally the guy says, the only thing I can do is give you potatoes. And this is before it started freezing, see. Well, there was no place to put the potatoes except underneath the house. And in the kitchen there was a trap door that went down, and there was dirt down there, just all dirt walls down, a root cellar-like deal. Dumped them all down there and filled up the whole place. Filled up. We had plenty of potatoes to eat until they froze underneath there. They did freeze. But we still eat them till next summer, spring. But I left there when I was 15, and I was going to join the Marines. So I went down. I was familiar with riding the boxcars, and the train would come by at a certain time in the afternoon, about 3-something, and they'd go down to the end of the line and say, Craig, and that's where my grandmother lived. So I'd go down there, and I had 50 cents. I'd go down there, and my cousin lived there, and see a show, theater there, and I'd hop that freight train and go down there. See, I'd get onto it when it was stopped, and get up in one of the cars. Usually there was hobos riding in it with me, I was just a kid, and they was a little protective. I remember one guy told me, yes, and there was some other guys in there, and they were hard up for money. They didn't have any. And he told me, he says, don't tell anybody you got any money. Don't tell any of these men. Just keep it yourself. You stay over here by me, he said, in the car. So this one time I decided to join the Marines, because it had some flyers out. When I get to town, Craig, I'd see the flyers, and boy, oh boy, that looked like the way to go. So there was a guy that I went to school with there, great big young kid, awkward as heck, and his sister lived in Denver, and that was where this mining camp was. It was just right in the very foothills of the Rockies, because it would sit right in the mouth of a canyon. And from then on, it was flat land to raise sheep and cattle. And I mean, lots of them. And so when you went in there, was rim rocks all around it. Rattlesnake hunting was good. And so we caught the freight. It was in the afternoon. Well, the days it was nice and warm, but it was still freezing at night because we was right in mountains. I had a thin brown sweater on. I had khaki suntans on, clothes. And boy, it wasn't enough. Boy, we got up in that high country, I mean up by Eagle and way up, I mean, above the highest places in Colorado. The train would go around, you could see it right across from you. And go the other way, looked like another train over there. And it was so cold that, boy, we was freezing. And the train wasn't going very fast. Winding around the mountains, we had to go over 2 mountain passes real high before we got to Denver. And the country was high in between, too. So I built a little fire, and one of the gondolas wasn't completely full of coal, and we built a little fire. And we lit it, got a little bit of paper and stuff, and keep our hands warm in the corner of the car. And boy, oh boy, we thought that was okay for a while. We could at least keep warm. And boy, we heard a racket out. The train stopped at one of the switches or something, a little town or something. Boy, over the top of that side of that car come a guy with a club. He was a brakeman, how they went. Boy, they running off the trains. Boy, oh boy, we went out the other side fast, and then we waited till the train got started again, and then we got on, but we didn't build no more fires, So we got up to, and we was freezing, but we got up to we was getting out of the mountains then. We'd survived, but boy, barely. And it was we got to this tunnel. It was the longest tunnel in the world at that time. It was the Moffat Tunnel, M-O-F-F-A-T. County was named Moffat County too. Moffat Tunnel, and they had the dates up over people were lined up over there looking at the opening. And here we was going down into this tunnel. Well, they warned us. They said there was gas in the tunnel, and it was 6 or 7 miles long. And you're on a train. That was a long time in a slow train. So we got in there. Before we could get out the other end of it, the train stopped. And it was the old, they burnt coal in them trains. My gosh, the smoke was so thick in that tunnel, we thought we was going to suffocate. But we got off that thing, and we headed to beat heck forward, and there wasn't much room between the side of the train and the rock on the side of the tunnel. We got up to finally made it to the other end. We could see daylight. And I don't remember how we got by that engine. Oh, it moved a little bit there, the engine. Anyway, we got up to that point, and we watched the cars went by coming out of it until we spotted that car. We had them great big corrugated water pipe or drain pipe, about 4 feet in diameter. That's where we were, and we got back on. We went to Denver, and the Marine Recruiting Service was 16th and Arapahoe Streets. And so we was pretty dirty and black, but we got into a service station, and we tried to clean up. And we made it to his sister's house. But in the process, we seen a sign beside I didn't know nothing about riding freight trains in the city. And this guy was with me. We seen a sign that says, yard limit, 6 miles. Boy, oh boy, but we thought that was it was yard limit. He says, you got to get off, the bulls will get us. That's the railroad stop. So he got off, and boy, it looked like to me there was nothing up ahead, no town, no structures. I stayed on there, and boy, the train started going fast. And I had to get off that thing. And I was looking at the ground. Well, I thought I'd just get off the train and the freight train, hang on to the ladder and run along and just gradually let go of it. But boy, it didn't work that way. I got off that freight train. I went off, and I'll tell you right now, I think I was, when I'd hit the ground, it was about every 20 feet. and finally, I just pushed myself away because I knew I was going to get underneath the wheels. And I spread right out on a flat, right in them cinders and ash they used to make the railroads out of. They'd, between the rails and the ties, they'd put them cinder. Boy, I was all bruised up. I'll tell you, I had big lumps on me. I thought I broke some ribs and they were sticking through, but they were just bruises. I ruined my watch. It was in my pocket. I just flattened it out. And it cut the material between the watch and the cinders. And I was mad at him because he had to get off then, left me. I had to get off. He was way back there. We walked, I don't know, it seemed like maybe it was 10 miles before we got up to Denver. Then I went to his sister's house, and I went down to 16th and Arapahoe and signed up for the Marines. And boy, they was glad to get me. And I guess they was strict enough. I was just the only one that passed as far as physical was concerned. I told them I had a little accident, and I scratched up some, I didn't tell them how. But, and they said, well, you can go to, where was it, San Diego. Well, the train's leaving this afternoon at 4 o'clock. And she said, all we have to do now is get permission from your parents. And up until that time, they never said anything about it, and I'd lied on them a couple of years on my age. See, get permission for your parents, and you'll be ready to go. And boy, was I embarrassed. They get, well, sorry, I guess we got a telegram back. You telegram your parents, and they said that you didn't have their consent, and you were only 15 years old. And boy, that was disheartening then. Of course, if I wasn't in there, I'd hit the whole war dead on. I'd have been down there a Marine. I'd been down in the South Pacific then. Maybe it was for a purpose.
So you hadn't told your mom and dad where you were going?
Oh no, I ran away from home. See. Yeah.
Now was this after Pearl Harbor?
No, it was before Pearl Harbor.
This is before Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
So things are warming up over in Europe yet, but.
Yeah, no, nothing was warming up. The only thing was they must have been building up for the Japs or something. It wasn't. It was before Pearl Harbor. No, before the war situation. Pretty peaceful then.
So then time went by and you finally got drafted. Is that right?
Yeah, I went to some. While I was during that period when I got a job in construction. I worked for the government in the National Youth Administration, NYA, and it was up to Steamboat Springs, which was 17 miles away. I just get a ride, and I worked there. And then right after that, of course, I had to drop out of school. And I went back to school a couple times. And then one night, January the 27th, 1942, the war started then, see. It was a month after December the 7th, January 27th, and 10:15, mine whistle began to blow. It was dark and real long blasts, We'd moved away from Wolf Creek, and we moved up to a better house. It had 3 rooms up on top of the hill, and not far opposite direction from the mine, but it was right up there where the other places were, and just above the school and the company store. Well, my dad says there's trouble at the mine. So he took off right now, and it was January 27th. There was a lot of ice and snow was deep. It already snowed in all my traps and everything. And it was, I remember the ice. I was trying to hurry, and there was crunchy ice, you know. I mean, I went by the next, about 2 houses over, that's where my buddy, my partner, we ran around with him. And went by him. Everybody was awake yet, you know. And we headed for the mine, which was about, just short distance away up there. And the people were all at the lamp house and around the dispatcher's office. And him and I went in, and I didn't see any of the other kids that went to school or the older boys or anything, but we went in and we went to work right away, helping. We gathered all the hot water, and we had to carry it from there over to where they hung their clothes up. You know, the miners did in their lamp house, and we brought buckets and buckets of hot water and made coffee for the people all night. Him and I did. Nobody else. And so the families are up there, and they was, you know, standing around the dispatcher's office outside. There's just a little office there. And the dispatcher's name, Joe Snyder was the dispatcher. He was an older fellow. And he was drawing names off on the list because the rescue party had got down into the mine. And what happened is the mine had exploded. And it was a gas explosion, natural gas. And he was checking off names off the list. I knew I'd look over his shoulder and see, you know, I'd come every so often, I'd be in and out. And the people were drinking a lot of coffee because it was cold and they needed it. And by gosh, the mine had exploded and killed everybody in it. There was 34 men in there. And so I worked there, I remember, all night, and me and my buddy to furnish coffee for the people. And then the next day, of course, they got rescue parties started coming in from Denver and stuff like that. All over, but they didn't save. And then they hauled the bodies out and they put them down in the miners' hall, and they asked me, because I knew a lot of the men. They were older, but I was sort of like a, you know, mascot. Like they always wanted to do something for me, you know. One guy made me a toboggan, and another guy let me use his skis all the time, wooden skis. You know, I'd borrow them. Didn't have any skis, and you needed them in the wintertime there. And I helped identify. They asked me to help identify the bodies, but it was hard to do because they was pretty well charred, and some of them were shrunk up. There wasn't very many. There was light colored. You know, they had that coal dust on them when the explosion had just baked that coal dust right into their skin. And my brother-in-law, he was in there, of course, and he lived with us. And the best of my knowledge, I identified him, you know. But they sure looked different. And that was we left the coal mines then. Went down to southern Colorado and further south by Grand Junction. My brother-in-law's parents, they lived down there in Cedar Ridge. From there, I went to Grand Junction and got a job at working for the Grazing Service Department of Interior. I was just a young kid, but they always liked me. I had worked in a road camp up there too, when I lived in Mount Harris, and up on one of the mountain passes, and it was cold as heck up there. We had a slab shack we lived in. So us and some of the miners were up there to work there too, because they, you know, drawing unemployment. But they didn't want to work. They finally quit. They said rather draw, what was it, $10 a week or something for compensation. And they were better than that. It was too hard up there working in crowbars, digging post holes along the side of the highway for these posts, you know, put the cables on. I finished on one job. the Monahan Construction out of Denver. Then I went for another job with a Larson Construction Company, and I stayed up there and endured it through. But it was nights. It was so cold that you suffered. We had a whirl drum that we built a fire in, and you could get the radiation out of that, but there was cracks in all the walls between the slabs. You know, they was uneven and they didn't fit together. You know, our bunks was just 2x4 frame with chicken wire, and you get what blankets you had. You got from home, you know. But then, of course, I was in between. When I was working out of Grand Junction for the Department of Interior, it was a grazing service. I liked the job. We'd go in with pack horses and we'd develop springs in the range country. There were a lot of wild horses there, and they benefited by the water. We put trails, we'd blast trails out of the rock and then we'd make big tanks out of a plank and with tar in the seams, and we'd pipe the water up that way and put a fence around it because the sheepmen and the cattlemen were fighting all the time, and my boss was a U.S. Deputy Marshal, so he had to control and make sure that they watered the cattle one time. Of course, after we left, they probably were fighting all the time, probably tore the fence down, but I know one time they got in a serious squabble over it, you know. We lived in tents. But it was an outdoor life, you know. And we had to drill the old-fashioned way. We'd drill into the sandstone with a little bit and a little scoop that you could drop in the hole and turn it a little bit and take out the fine dust after you hammered it with a sledgehammer. Then we'd set a charge off and blow that stuff, you know, blow it out like that. I learned how to use it that way. And then from then on, my dad says, my uncle's up here in Washington in a logging camp, so my uncle would talk to my dad and says, come on up, I can get you a job. Of course, by then, the jobs had opened up. So we come up to Simpson's logging camp in old Camp 5, and we went to work the next day, all of us. Well, it was my dad and I and I think one other guy from Colorado come up. So we had bunkhouses then, and we started getting food, good food. I mean, the best food I'd ever eaten. In fact, boy, we thought that was one. We'd never seen food like that. And that Camp 5, Simpson Camp 5.
Is that outside of Shelton?
Yeah, west of Shelton there. It's gone, long since gone, but it was big timber up in the Oxbow up there in Wainuchi. And we stayed in the bunkhouses. But then we found out that they needed men at the shipyard, Bremerton Naval Yard, and they was going to pay, to me, a nickel, so a lot of money. It was going to pay, I think it was a nickel more an hour. So we quit there, and my dad didn't. He stayed there. But my uncle was working there too, so he was the one who got us the job. So I went to work at the Navy Yard in Bremerton. I worked in the supply department. And around as a night as a sort of a roving like watchman up there. I don't know why they give me the job, but I would be with a naval officer or something. I'd go around with him, and then they'd put me in the building sometime, like in the supply department, and I just stayed in there in a hallway or where I could find a place to sit down and just watch so there wasn't anybody prowling around all the time, you know. And then I quit there and went back to Colorado again, and with a gut buddy, we earned enough money up there. We went back there and we decided, well, we can make it better now. We went back to work in the coal mines there. After the explosion, there was another mine right across the river. Went to work there for a while, and then I come back to Washington and went back to Navy Yard. And then it was hard to get away from the Navy Yard. My sister was down in New Mexico, and her husband worked for the for the Department of the Interior, the Soil Conservation Service. Yeah, tied up here. And so from there, I went down to the Lieutenant Commander Sass, was in charge of the Navy Yard, and you had to see him before you quit and give him a good reason. So I went in to see him. I said, I was going to head for New Mexico, get a job with the railroad down there. I had a job down there. Apprentice telegraph operator in the office, and writing train orders and dispatching the stuff, trains too. A lot of troop trains come through on the Santa Fe Railroad. And but I told the lieutenant commander, he says, I'll tell you where you ought to be. He says, you ought to be in the service. I says, I think so too. I said, whenever they need me, I said, I'm registered, they'll call me. And I said, I won't try to get out of it. I said, I'll go. I mean, that was just standard. And so I went down there, and I worked down there wasn't very long. I was on the railroad. It was way out in some little town there. Right out there. I worked at Fort Sumner for a short time, and Carlsbad for a short time. And from Carlsbad, I went to Fort Sumner. And boy, I'll tell you, there wasn't much in that country. That's where Billy the Kid got shot. So they transferred me out to a little Mexican town named Encino, New Mexico. And it only had, they were all Mexicans that lived there, Nice, I liked them. And there was several white families that they'd worked in the office with me there. And 3 or 4 other guys and their families that were there, and a school teacher. So I boarded with a school teacher, his wife, and worked there. And finally, by gosh, I went over and had the post office there, and I got my little mailbox there. Went over there one morning and to check my mail on the way to work. A lot of rattlesnakes around there. I killed a big one right across the street from the post office. Of course, it was just a paved road, then the sandy shoulders, right by somebody's yard. And I killed him, a big one. Some little girl was there, and she was hollering at me. And rattlesnake. I went over and I killed him. I'd throw rocks at him and miss him, and she'd go pick up the rocks for me. It wasn't many rocks, it was sandy. And then after I killed the snake, then she took a stick and hung him up over the fence so it'd rain. That was what they said, they'd make it rain. So he was a big one too. And then I got my call for the Army, so the dispatcher, the agent there, L.P. Schenck, he says, "Well, Woko," she says, I'll get the dispatcher right now." And he says, he'll make arrangements for your deferment. I says, and the dispatcher I talked to him after that. He said, "Well, you can get a deferment, get it all processing, I said, "Well, wait a minute." I said, I don't think I wanted a deferment. I said, I promised a guy one time, this is the guy at the Navy Yard, I said, when it come my time to go and I was called, I was going to go. So I said, I'm going to go. And that's the way it was. And I went to Fort Lewis, I went to Seattle, had my examination, went to Fort Lewis, and we got inducted. And right away, I transferred me down to Camp Adair, Oregon. Well, I was with some of my friends here in Shelton, and I wanted to stay with them. And I had a chance to go in the Air Force. I was qualified to go in the Air Force. And then, but the other ones, they weren't. And we had buddies, so I thought, well, I'll go. I want to stay with them, And so I canceled out on that. And we had a chance to go too in the paratroopers. And they paid that extra $5 a month, I think, pay. But I just says, well, I want to stay with it. I'll just stay with the guy. Well, I didn't stay with him because they split up, and I never seen some of them again. And I know one of my best buddies was killed in Italy. He was from Olympia here. His name was Roy Enlow. And then, so I took my training, real good training, I'll say you.
Do you remember your first day? I mean, they always show training as these sergeants coming in and they're yelling at you and screaming at you. Is that what training was like for you? Did they try to get you broke down first, or what was it like when you got put in the service?
Well, we had the drill officers, you know, and drill sergeants. When you get out and on the training, like for instance, there's some pictures in there. I hope they got them in. Drill instructors, they were pretty aggressive, which was right. I mean, I could tell they never chewed you out unless they had a reason for you. They didn't go around bellowing real loud like, you know, you have to say sir or all that stuff. No, it was more level-headed and calm. There was a special quality to it, you know what I mean? And they trained you good. They didn't waste no time or anything like that. I mean, it's a concentration, because if you start that stuff, this drill, like these drill instructors getting this holler and sir, 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 and all that stuff, that affects your training. It seriously affects your training, because you know, most people all know what they have to do, and they know it's for their life is dependent on. That's why I say that I had the best training in 6 months of excellent training. And what I did right off the bat is I'd go in strong. When we had this physical training, you know, like judo and stuff like that, well, I picked the biggest guys in the company to be my adversary, see? And they liked it, they know it. One was named Hammerland. You know, the other name was Grossbeck. I seen his name in one of my piles of getting wounded men out over in France. And he was, I could take Hammerland. We just about an even match. And when we started, everybody in the company would gather around and watch us. And but it was a 50-50 deal. I'd take him one time, he'd take me the next time. But when it come to Grossbeck, he was these guys were a little older than me, especially Grossbeck. And boy, he was a big guy. His arms was my arms was about half his size or less, you know. It looked like little sticks compared to his. And boy, I'd try every trick on him I could to get him, and he'd take me all the time. So we got good. Physically training, I was excellent. The tallest guy in the outfit was around 7 feet, and his name was Schaefer. He was related to some of the Schaefers here in the area, you know, like out in Montana and all that and stuff. And he would, long legs, he'd usually carry the guide on the flag in, and I'd be right behind him. They'd take my name down, too, and that was the name of the first ones in from the company on a forced march, you know. So I was just trying to do what I was supposed to do. I never did get assigned to KP or nothing, extra duty, because I had pulled some blunders, you know. I mean, one time I'd been up here and I got back late in the morning. I'd been up to visit my mother. And this bunch of us get together from Shelton here, all around. It wasn't in my same company, but we get together and come up here and visit his home, and we go back at the last minute and drive like maniacs down that old highway, old 99 south, and dangerous as heck. And so we went and got that, like I say, got that good training with machine guns, heavy machine guns, what I was trained in. And like I said, never was any sign for anything. One time I got in trouble. I come in and the lights were supposed to be out. When I got back about 10 o'clock in the barracks, and the first platoon was downstairs and the second platoon was upstairs. And I got fight with another guy. I mean, they moved the beds around while I was gone. and moved my bed, messed it up and everything, moved it down. So when I got back, there was another bed frame there. There was this other guy laying in my bed, where I was. Well, boy, I turned on the lights. I woke up the whole barracks, and I grabbed him and threw him off the bed. I made a hell of a ruckus out of it up there. Well, nobody interfered. I think they all covered up their heads. But I got my bed back till the next morning. They asked us, by the way, what was the lights doing on at that time? So I stepped up and I turned them on, sir. What for? Well, I says, they'd moved my bed around while I was gone, and I had to look for it. I had to have some light to see. Must have been a good answer, because I never said anything more about it, But I went and volunteered for the officers' mess, the battalion officers' mess, and because you get good food down there. And as a table waiter, see, it wasn't like KP, it was a table waiter, but of course you did peel potatoes and stuff like that, and I'd wait on the officers. Well, it worked real good, except I was dishing up the oyster stew. And boy, I would dish it up, with a spoon, and I never dished up anything like that before, any time. I hold it into the officers, and they'd eat, and I'd say, well, is there any oysters in this stew? I says, well, I don't know. I said, that's all there's in the kettle, So I dished it all up. But what happened is I didn't dip down to the bottom of the stuff, and when I got it all dished out and the supper was over, it went down a couple inches, and there was just a solid mass of oysters down below. Now, the mess sergeant told me, Woko, he says, you should have given the boss some of them oysters. I said, well, I didn't know they was down there. I know they sunk at the bottom, or anything like that. And so, boy, I sat down with a canteen cup, and I filled up full of oysters. He says, well, you better help eat them. Well, when I was leaving there, after a while, he said I did a good job that evening. He says, well, here are you, Frank. He said, Woko, they call me. I told him. He says, take these pies back up to your outfit. We got a bunch of peach pies here. Would you like to take them back to your outfit? I said, yeah. Well, he got me a box, and boy, nice peach pies. I'll tell you, I put a layer of peach pies. I put them over my shoulder like this, and boy, I walked up there, and it was about a half a mile from Officer's Mess back up there. Got in the bottom stairs, bottom barracks, first platoon, and walks in with them pies, Guys, I said, anybody want any pies? I got some peach pie here. Of course, they all knew that I went for duty at the Officer's Mess, and oh my God, them guys come in and they grabbed them pies, and boy, they was eating them down. I just had a couple left when I got up to second platoon, and the guys got mad at me up there. Woko, how come you didn't give us the pies? This is your platoon. They said, I said, well, they just mobbed me down there and grabbed all the pies. Well, okay, they paid for it. Because, boy, they got the GI so bad down there. And I told them, I said, well, that's why I give them all to the first platoon. I says, I didn't have any idea what the situation's going to be. I said, that's why I give them all to the first platoon. I says, because I didn't want any of you guys to get sick, But boy, they got them, and they was mad at me for a week after that.
I got to switch.